Good day. Today is Friday, 9th May 2025, the day that is celebrated as Victory Day in many places and specifically in Russia. And there has in fact been several ceremonies in Russia celebrating Victory Day. There's been a military parade in Red Square, which I have not yet had time to watch. There has been a speech by President Putin to the assembled dignitaries on Red Square. There's been a flypast. There's also been many other celebrations in many other Russian cities, and not just cities in Russia, I should stress, but also in many other places in Europe as well and around the world. And there's also been many meetings between President Putin of Russia and various visiting heads of state, including very lengthy discussions between President Putin and President Xi Jinping of China. Now, I should, before I deal with the details of what has happened, do two things. The first, which is by far the most important, is to congratulate everybody who is celebrating victory in Europe, victory over Germany, fascist Germany, in the Second World War today, to wish them all a very happy holiday. Now, I should say that my own family had strong memories of the Second World War, of the incredible violence of that war, of the extreme oppression and cruelty that was visited upon my home city of Athens by the German occupying armies during the Second World War. My father, for the record, was twice arrested by the occupation authorities. On one occasion, he only just missed being executed, and I'm not going to discuss the details of that in this program, but he was repeating them to me all his life, right up to the moment of his death. And a week before his death, I remember having a discussion with him in which he told me that for various reasons he had not expected to survive the war, and that he attributed the fact of his survival obviously to the Allied victory, but first and foremost to the victory of the Soviet Union and of the Red Army. So he impressed all of that on me, and of course he was not the only one who I met and spoke to during my life, who lived through that time and who spoke to me of the very harrowing events that they experienced. And not just in Greece, but in other places in Europe as well. I belong to that generation born in the 1960s, for which the war was still a very recent memory in my childhood. Everybody that I knew who was around middle age had fought in the war or had been involved in the war in some way. And by the way, I should say that when I started to visit Germany as well, I met many people in Germany also, people who had fervently supported the regime, and who in every case felt deep remorse and genuine and sincere remorse for what had happened during that time and for what that regime which they had supported had carried out, and what many Germans had been involved in doing also. And as I also discovered, and it became something I remarked upon, there were many Germans as well, more perhaps than people quite understand, who are always much more skeptical about the regime and what it was doing, and who were hostile to its policies. And I know this is not widely acknowledged, or at least many people resist acknowledging that fact, but I have no doubt at all of its truth. So there we go. That is an important day, a very important day. And in saying all of this, I want to say something further, which is that I am becoming extremely concerned, very alarmed indeed, at the way in which the entire history of this event is being gradually modified and revised and adjusted, for example, in order to suit political needs, especially in Western countries. A systematic policy of downplaying and minimizing what the Russian and Soviet contribution was to the Allied victory. And to be clear, it was colossal. It was not just colossal, it was indispensable. It is impossible to imagine a conventional military victory having been achieved over Germany without the contribution of the Red Army. If the regime had been defeated without the Red Army, it could only have been achieved through the use of nuclear weapons. That is my own belief. And had nuclear weapons been used in 1945 in Europe, well, we would be living with that effect today. And it's difficult again to imagine that alternative reality. And perhaps we shouldn't probe too deeply into it. Just saying. So I am becoming more and more concerned and aggravated, and I know a lot of other people share these feelings, with the way in which this whole experience is being, this whole extraordinary experience is being shaped and adjusted and readjusted in order to suit the particular political agendas that we follow in Western countries today. And I'm not going to say too much about this because it is a painful topic. What I will say is that two European leaders, President Vučić of Serbia and Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia, have visited Moscow, as is their right, to celebrate this victory, which, by the way, their countries hugely contributed to, and which was bound up in the history of both of these countries with the victory of the Red Army. And I am absolutely shocked. I am beside myself with incomprehension. The attempts made by certain European governments to prevent these two leaders reaching Moscow, and the incredibly complicated journeys that the aircraft had to fly in order eventually to reach the Russian capital. It leaves me incredulous. I could say the same about the Auschwitz celebration that took place a few months ago, from which representatives of Russia and, by the way, Israel were excluded, which again I find incredible, given who suffered in Auschwitz and who liberated Auschwitz. Just saying. The pattern of this repeats itself in so many things and in so many ways that I'm not even going to start to discuss that. Certainly, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I accept no argument of equivalence in terms of the war. I lived too close to the war to accept that argument at all. Just saying. And I've known far too many victims of that war on both sides of the war to accept that argument of equivalence, which is now being made by some people in any way whatsoever. Anyway, that is one thing I wanted to say. There's probably an awful lot more that I can say, but obviously this is a program primarily about international relations today, though, as I said, the shadow of the war, the Second World War, does fall very hard upon us all still, even if some people don't want to acknowledge it and some people want to adjust and just the reality. But there is something else I do want to say, and it comes back to something that I said yesterday. And that is about the fact that Victory Day is celebrated in Western Europe on the 8th of May and in Russia on the 9th of May. And I said that this is all connected to the fact that Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the surrender of the Germans a day earlier than the Soviets were happy with, because they were not in a position to participate in that event for all kinds of reasons, which I'm not going to dwell on in this program. Well, I got it completely wrong, very embarrassing, and I want to thank Larry Johnson for the correction, because what actually happened was that Field Marshal Montgomery, the British Commander-in-Chief, accepted the surrender of the Germans on the 7th of May. The Russians were indeed absolutely furious about this. The Soviets were furious about this. The ceremony was then held all over again, and it was held on the following day. Because of differences in the time zones, this fell on the 8th of May in Europe, but on the 9th of May in Russia. So the actual timing of the celebration is the same. It's just that there is a calendrical difference. So I just want to take this opportunity to correct that and to thank Larry Johnson for the correction. Just saying. Well, let's now return to the events that are playing out, especially in Europe. But before I do that, I think I do need to say more about the conflict between India and Pakistan. Now, in my program yesterday, I spoke about the fact that it seemed to me that both sides, despite the fierce rhetoric, were, to some extent at least, pulling their punches. And I hoped that that meant that the conflict would not escalate out of control and that we would fall short of an outright war, which would be potentially a disaster. And, well, I have to say, a few hours later, events played out, and I'm afraid that I might have been too optimistic about my assessment. I ought to stress that the fog of war remains extremely heavy, and it's very difficult to know exactly what is taking place. There are many, many rumours, a lot of film, and it's difficult to assess that film. I also ought to add that both governments, the Indian and Pakistani government, exercise very tight information control, tighter, interestingly, than Russia and Ukraine do in terms of their own conflict. And for someone like myself, who's not familiar with all the ins and outs of the conflict, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of what exactly is happening. But anyway, my hopes that after the Indian strike and after the Pakistani claims to have shot down large numbers of Indian aircraft, claims which I thought yesterday, and by the way, still believe today, were probably inflated, or at least went beyond what had actually been shot down. Anyway, I hoped and believed that each side would feel that honour was satisfied and that the situation would then begin to quieten down. Unfortunately, it hasn't done so. And in fact, there have been many reports of further fighting, more exchanges of fire, more combat operations. There were drone attacks by Pakistan against Indian towns near the border and Indian facilities. The Indians claimed that they repelled all those attacks. The Indian air defences seem to have been very active. There were reports yesterday coming from Pakistani sources of a gigantic aerial battle between Indian and Pakistani fighter jets, carried out, by the way, at great distances from each other. The Indian aircraft supposedly stayed on their side of the contact line, the Pakistani aircraft on their side of the contact line also. So this was a conflict, an engagement carried out at long range with long-range missiles, each side relying on its radars and things of this kind. Impossible to get a sense of exactly who gained the better of that battle. In both cases, there are now reports that each side has shot down fighter jets belonging to the other, though I expect and believe that in each case, this is also provoking heated denials. There were reports in the Indian media that a Pakistani pilot had been captured. I've seen no evidence of that, but those reports apparently do exist. And anyway, the overall picture is one of the situation escalating rather than de-escalating, as I had hoped. Now, I hope, nonetheless, that at some point this situation will indeed be brought under control. The Pakistani government spoke yesterday about the situation being dangerously close to all-out war. I earnestly hope that that disaster can be avoided. But, as I said, it doesn't look promising or good in any way at the present time. Now, I'm not in a position to assess the decision-making that each side is making, but the Financial Times, at least, has written an article which essentially points the finger at the Pakistani military chief, who General Munir, who is alleged to be the person who is playing, if not the primary role in the ongoing escalation, at least a significant role. Again, I don't know to what extent this is true, but I'm going to repeat this article, and I invite people from both of these countries and people who are more up to date with the situation to perhaps write on the threads and even contact me and discuss what they think of the truth of this article. Anyway, it says this: in Pakistan, the public, unaware of militant training camps in their midst and conditioned to see Pakistan as the victim, is clamoring for retaliation. Whatever happens next will depend on one man, the country's army chief, Asim Munir. Munir controls Pakistan's strategic decision-making far more than the elected government led by Prime Minister Sharif, and he is not a figure known for his restraint. One of the reasons that Delhi believes that Pakistan-based militants were behind the April attack, is because of a speech that General Munir delivered a week before. In it, he referred to Kashmir as Pakistan's jugular vein and vowed not to leave Kashmiris alone in their struggle for independence from India. He expressed the polarizing view, I don't know where polarizing, presumably within Pakistan, that Pakistan came into being in 1947 because Hindus and Muslims could not live together. In doing so, Munir has departed dramatically from the outlook of his predecessor, General Qamar Javed Bajwa, who in 2021 spoke about burying the hatchet with India, mainly because in his, Bajwa's estimation, Pakistan couldn't afford to fight a war. Munir was once Bajwa's head of the Inter-Services Intelligence, the military's prime intelligence agency. Back then he didn't contradict his boss. Now that he's in charge, he seems on taking the military back to its old posture of vying for control of Kashmir and treating India as the prime enemy. Munir has a reputation for hewing to his religious and ideological beliefs and disliking being challenged. Some of his older colleagues recall him leaving the room when contradicted, even during informal conversations among officers. Anyway, there's a lot more about this. I'm not going to myself point fingers at General Munir. I'd be quite frank and say that I had heard of him before last week, but he was not somebody I thought of or knew much about before then. I don't know whether this pen portrait of him that the Financial Times has published is true, but of course if it is, then I would say that he does urgently need to be advised by people in Pakistan that in Pakistan's own interests, an all-out confrontation with India leading to an all-out war is a disastrously bad idea. Anyway, that's my own view of the situation, such as it is, my assessment. As I said, it looks as if my hopes of yesterday that we were looking at a de-escalation have not been realised. It could be that that's in part because of General Munir's attitudes, or it might be that there's a more complicated story at play. But either way, I still hope that it will be brought under control in some form or in some way over the next couple of days. I ought to quickly add that if there is any mediation going on by any other third party, it is being carried out in a very, very private, confidential way. The Trump administration has said that it is not involved in any mediation. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has said that the United States does not intend to become involved in this conflict. If the Russians are doing anything, then they're doing it so discreetly as to be invisible. And I would say that, in fact, so discreetly that I doubt, actually, that they are, in fact, doing very much. The Pakistanis do seem to have made an effort to try to get the Russians to mediate, but perhaps the calculation in Moscow is that attempting to do that would put relations with India under stress, and that is absolutely something that Russia is not prepared to do. So at the moment, it looks as if the conflict is being played out entirely between India and Pakistan themselves, and I hope that they have the wisdom and the self-control to bring the situation back under control. Well, that is all I'm going to say about this conflict, except that obviously it is a cause of serious worry. Well, anyway, in the meantime, world leaders have been speaking to each other, as they always do. President Trump and President Zelensky had a telephone conversation yesterday. This happened directly after the Ukrainian parliament ratified the investment fund / mineral extractions deal that has been talked about and discussed so much. President Trump spoke about how this deal finally had managed to get the United States control of important rare earth deposits in Ukraine. Well, that remains to be seen. There were some reports before the decision by the Ukrainian parliament to ratify this agreement that various caveats had been inserted by the parliament into this ratification. The parliament has not been able to see all of the documents that come together with this deal, nor have I. Well, maybe so. I haven't seen any evidence of these caveats myself, but then I haven't seen the legislation or the decree. Directly after the news or at least Donald Trump's own announcement, that the Ukrainian parliament had ratified the mineral rights extraction deal. Trump and Zelensky spoke on the phone. Zelensky, again, apparently insisted on the forward movement with the 30-day ceasefire that the Americans and the Ukrainians agreed to propose at their meeting in Jeddah back in March. The Ukrainians have run with that proposal ever since. When Putin and Trump spoke to each other over the phone on the 18th of March, Putin set all kinds of conditions for before he would agree to the 30-day ceasefire. He said that proper supervisory mechanisms had to be created, and given the history of Ukraine using ceasefires to rebuild its military positions and to reorganize and reinforce and rearm its armed forces, for such a ceasefire to take effect, the United States and the Western powers would have to agree to cease all military supplies and intelligence sharing to Ukraine over the period of the ceasefire. Now, that was the Russian position. It was restated yesterday by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. She gave a strong statement saying that while Russia is still open to a ceasefire, it has to be on the conditions that President Putin previously laid out. Zelensky has shown no interest in any of this, and of course he is hardly likely to agree to a freeze on arms supplies or the provision of intelligence during the time when the ceasefire is in place. In fact, he's absolutely going to reject that. But anyway, he had that conversation with Trump in which he again spoke about the importance of moving towards that ceasefire. That continues to be his objective. Now, Trump, after that discussion, published on Truth Social this comment: talks with Russia-Ukraine continue. The US calls for, ideally, a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Hopefully, an acceptable ceasefire will be observed, and both countries will be held accountable for respecting the sanctity of these direct negotiations. If the ceasefire is not respected, the United States and its partners would impose further sanctions. Thousands of young soldiers are dying on a weekly basis, and everybody should want it to stop. I do, and the United States of America does also. As president, I will stay committed to securing peace between Russia and Ukraine, together with the Europeans, and a lasting peace it will be. This ceasefire must ultimately build towards a peace agreement. It can all be done very quickly, and I will be available on a moment's notice if my services are needed. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Well, that is actually a very muddled statement, even by Trump's standards, and it seems to want to have it all kinds of different ways, but it seems actually less optimistic about the prospect of negotiations and ceasefires than many of the other things that he has said in the past. By way of illustration, he says that the US calls for ideally a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Hopefully, an acceptable ceasefire will be observed. Ideally, hopefully, doesn't look as if he's very confident it's actually going to happen. And then he talks about how the United States will enforce the ceasefire by imposing, if it ever comes into existence, by imposing sanctions on the violator in the event that the terms of the ceasefire are violated. That, to my mind, says two things. Firstly, that for the moment at least, Donald Trump is not planning to impose further sanctions. I say for the moment, I mean today. Tomorrow it may be different. He's still waiting or trying to get some kind of movement in the peace process going before he turns to doing things like that. But, of course, he's still talking about sanctions, and the Russians definitely are going to see these comments as a threat to themselves, because they know, as night follows day, that if there is a ceasefire and the ceasefire is violated, whichever side has actually violated it, the United States will inevitably blame Russia and will therefore move to impose sanctions upon Russia. Anyway, that's what Trump said. Notice that he also talks about negotiations. He speaks about respecting the sanctity of direct negotiations. He does appear to want negotiations, direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, something which Zelensky is still rejecting. Zelensky insists that he's not going to enter into negotiations with the Russians unless he gets his ceasefire. Not clear why, by the way. He's never explained why he does not want to sit down and talk with the Russians unless there is a ceasefire. As I have said on many occasions, in many, many wars, in the vast majority of wars, there are negotiations first. Those negotiations make progress. Those negotiations bring us to the point where there is a truce or an armistice. And then, of course, once that point has been passed, we then move forward to the next point, which is the final agreement. But usually we get negotiations before the ceasefire is announced. Zelensky says he won't accept that. He wants negotiations only after a ceasefire is in place. In reality, of course, as we all know, he has no real intention of reaching any kind of final agreement that the Russians would require or would accept. So he wants the ceasefire so as to basically stop the Russian army in its tracks, confident that in that event he can spin out the negotiations and start to get political pressure from the United States and his allies to end the war on his terms. So that's what he is talking about. But anyway, Trump doesn't seem to be opting between the two. He talks about a ceasefire and he talks about direct negotiations, and he uses these terms almost interchangeably. He doesn't seem to understand that the Russians want the one, direct negotiations, and the Ukrainians insist on the other, a ceasefire, and that there is no common ground on this point between them. And anyway, he then says that he is committed to securing peace between Russia and Ukraine together with the Europeans, and wants it to be a lasting peace, and that the ceasefire must ultimately build towards a peace agreement, and it can all be done very quickly, and he's available at a moment's notice if his services are needed, which again suggests that he wants to move the process forward. He's keen to do it as quickly as possible. But at the moment, as I said, judging on the basis of these words that he's just published on Truce Social, he is not confident. He is less confident than he has ever been that he is in fact close to achieving that objective. Just saying. So anyway, that's the point where we are at this particular time, at least with Donald Trump. Now, his vice president, perhaps this is a coordinated thing between Trump and Vance, is again taking a much more, shall I say, realistic position about the state of the negotiations or the discussions over the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. J.D. Vance gave an interview with Fox News, and over the course of it, he is reported to have said this: "We knew that Russia would ask for too much because the Russian perception of the war is, on the ground, they are winning. Of course, the Ukrainians would like to do a ceasefire, and in part that things have not been going so well for the Ukrainians over the last few months." Now, that is absolutely correct. The Russians are very skeptical of a ceasefire at the present time. Their army is advancing. They are under no pressure to agree to a truce. They don't need time to reorganize or re-equip or reinforce or any of those things. They've got the Ukrainians essentially on the ropes. Any prolonged truce in which there weren't stringent conditions attached would work to the Ukrainian advantage. So why would the Russians agree? They're prepared to enter into direct negotiations with the Ukrainians, but they're not prepared to agree to a ceasefire. They know that if there was a ceasefire, the Ukrainians would spin things out. They would evade coming to any kind of agreement. The Russians would quickly find themselves in a frozen conflict type situation, and none of that works to the Russian interest. By contrast, the Ukrainians are losing the war, and for that reason, if for no other, it makes sense for them to seek a ceasefire which would stop the Russians from advancing further, deeper into Ukrainian territory and inflicting more damage on the Ukrainian army. So it is completely understandable that in this kind of situation, the Russians are skeptical about a ceasefire, and the Ukrainians, by contrast, are seeking one. It is interesting and perhaps important that there is at least one person within the administration, the Trump administration, who gets it, and who also gets it, that the Russians feel that they have no real reason to water down their demands, to soften their demands, because straightforwardly, they are winning the war. And unless their demands are satisfied, they will be able to obtain them, they will be able to achieve them through military victory on the battlefield. Well, that's the Americans. The Americans are still in discussion about the way forward. The Russians have been making comments of their own. Now, firstly, Putin's spokesman, Yuri Ushakov, has been speaking, and he has said some quite interesting things. He has said, firstly, that the Victory Day ceasefire, unilaterally announced by Putin, is a continued test of Ukraine's willingness to seek peace. If the Ukrainians violate the ceasefire, then it's an indication that they're not seeking peace. If they abide by the ceasefire, then in that case, perhaps they are. To anticipate, the Ukrainians have abided by the ceasefire only very, very partially. They have attacked the Russians in several places, as the Russian Defense Ministry has been complaining. They have in particular attacked the Russians in the area of Kursk region, where they continue in their efforts to capture the village of Totkino on Russian territory. But Ushakov also went on to say something else. He was asked whether the Russians were concerned about the fact that the United States, the Trump administration, was disappointed with Russia, with Russia's response to the negotiations. Ushakov replied to that Russia is in fact more disappointed with the United States than the United States is disappointed with Russia. Quite a tough comment, and another indicator perhaps that the Russians are in no mood to soften their terms for ending the war. Well, that's the exchanges between Russia and the United States. There are some positive things to say, nonetheless. Donald Trump had floated the possibility of a summit meeting between himself and Putin over the course of Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, which is expected to take place shortly. Well, Trump is now admitting that the summit meeting will not take place then, and for the moment at least, we've got no indication of when the summit meeting will happen. But Peskov was asked about a summit meeting between Putin and Trump, and though Peskov said that there is still work to do to prepare for this summit meeting, the Russians and the Americans are moving step by step closer to the point when such a summit meeting might indeed take place. And I suspect that the Russians feel that the American agreement that there should be direct negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians is definitely a significant step forward by the Americans in their direction. Now, that was what Peskov said. Perhaps even more interesting is that in sharp contrast to what used to happen during the period of the Biden administration, when there were no messages or greetings or friendly messages or contacts of any kind between the American and Russian presidents whatsoever, even on the most important matters and even on the most important things. This time, Trump and Putin have apparently exchanged congratulatory messages to each other on the occasion of Victory Day. So that does suggest that something positive is in the works. Well, for the moment at least, the Americans and the Russians not making a huge amount of progress, but we do see that there is a voice within the administration, the Trump administration, J.D. Vance, that does seem to have a realistic understanding of things and maybe pushing things in what I personally think is the right direction. There is, of course, the other relationship that the Russians also have, which is a very contentious one for the Americans and a very concerning one, and that is the relationship between Russia and China. Now, Xi Jinping is the main visitor, foreign visitor, the most important foreign minister in Moscow on the occasion of Victory Day. And there have been a string of meetings between himself and Putin over the course of the last few hours. Specifically, there was a meeting where they spoke initially one-to-one. They gave a joint press conference, though I should say they didn't take questions. They merely made statements. That's not unusual, by the way. Xi Jinping and Putin rarely answer questions when they meet from the media, partly because so many of the topics they discuss are heavily classified and frankly they don't want to talk about them. But anyway, Putin and Xi did have a meeting, they did have a press conference, but they also had an enlarged meeting with lots of officials participating. Now, I don't yet have a list of all the Chinese officials, but the Russian list is enormous, and once again, it is clear to me that virtually the entire Russian government participated in the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. And I'm sure that on the Chinese side, the Chinese delegation was at least as strong. Just saying. Now, we haven't been given a really clear, direct picture of all of the things that were discussed. There's a list of many agreements that were reached between the two leaders, but these are just names of agreements. We don't know the contents in detail. I have speculated in various programs that on the basis of comments made by Chinese officials, it seemed to me as if Power of Siberia 2, the second pipeline joining Russia with China, was about to, the agreement to get it going was close to being, very close to being finalized. And I speculated that over the course of Xi Jinping's visit, there might even be a signing ceremony. Well, it doesn't look as if that is going to happen. But I did notice that Putin mentioned this pipeline on 2 occasions over the course of his discussions. And he said that the pipeline would be launched in 2027. In other words, just over a year from now. Now, that strongly suggests to me that, yes, there are probably still some outstanding issues that need to be resolved, but that there has indeed been a breakthrough in the talks, probably on the funding and costing issues, and that probably work is now underway on completing a final draft of the agreement, which will probably, by the way, run to hundreds and maybe even thousands of pages if you include the various annexes and sub-annexes and things of this kind, and which will also, incidentally, include third parties, either Mongolia or Kazakhstan. And, well, we could get a signing ceremony at some point over the course of the next few months. I think we are very close on this issue now. So, clearly, convergence between China and Russia continues. The grand strategic partnership between China and Russia continues. Chinese troops participated in the ceremonies on Red Square. And of course, this relationship between China and Russia remains the major concern for the United States. Now, this brings me to an article, a recent article that appeared at the end of April, written in, I believe it was Foreign Policy, by my old friend, Mr. Aaron Wes Mitchell. Now, many people will know that it was actually Foreign Affairs. I feel that Mr. Wes Mitchell played a key role in setting up the conditions for the Ukraine conflict. To be precise, in August 2021, after a summit meeting between Putin and Biden in Geneva, which it now turns out did not go well, a summit meeting in which Biden pressed Putin to break with China and Putin refused. Anyway, this article, an article appeared by Mr. Wes Mitchell in August 2021 in the National Interest, in which Mr. Wes Mitchell spoke about the danger of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, the fact that it was existentially dangerous to the United States, and the importance of breaking this relationship between China and Russia, breaking it down. And he proposed a plan of action. He proposed that the United States should work towards inflicting a defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And he then anticipated that as a result of that defeat, Russia would change its alignment, would subordinate its foreign policy to the United States, would become an American ally or even vassal, and that would then break the alliance between China and Russia. And Mr. West Mitchell did not say specifically and expressly in this article that his objective was regime change in Moscow. But obviously, in order to achieve that outcome, that was clearly the intention and the purpose of the strategic defeat, the defeat of Russia in Ukraine that he was talking about. That was in August 2021. And to be said straightforwardly, I think that what happened thereafter followed far too closely to the outline of what Mr. West Mitchell set out in this August 2021 National Interest article to be a coincidence. Steps followed one after the other, creating first a crisis in Ukraine, then an armed conflict there. Then the United States and its allies moved immediately to impose massive sanctions on Russia, to declare economic war on Russia. They did so clearly in the expectation that this would collapse Russia's economy. The French finance minister actually straightforwardly admitted as much. And when that failed to happen, in the winter of 2022-2023, the Western powers, and we now know the extent of their direct military involvement in the war, started massive preparations for a military offensive to be conducted theoretically by Ukraine, but in practice deeply involving themselves in the summer of 2023 to break through to the Black Sea, to defeat the Russians militarily in Ukraine, to encircle Crimea, to achieve in another way that defeat of Russia that Mr. West Mitchell was talking about. And I again believe that this was the objective. It was to defeat Russia, provoke regime change in Moscow, cause a rupture between China and Russia, and a realignment of Russia with the United States, transforming Russia in effect into a satellite of the United States and isolating and in effect encircling China. So I believe that was the plan, and I'm going to say it very straightforward. I don't know this for a fact. There is speculation and theorizing on my part, but I suspect that whoever was behind that, all of that, was at least heavily influenced by Mr. West Mitchell's article, or conceivably it went further than this, and that article basically described a plan that was being discussed in Washington by all the relevant people in the summer of 2021, and which was subsequently put into action. Well, things have turned out otherwise. Russia's economy didn't break. The 2023 offensive was a failure. Since then, the war has shifted into Russia's favor. The Russians are advancing across Ukraine. Ukraine is still holding out, but it is facing a gathering military crisis, and the situation has turned out differently from the one that Mr. West Mitchell in August 2021 might have hoped for. So now he's written another article, and it is, as I said, in Foreign Affairs, and its title is The Return of Great Power Diplomacy, and the subtitle is How Strategic Deal-Making Can Fortify American Power. And, well, it doesn't actually reference back to that previous article of August 2021. That August 2021 article has essentially disappeared into a memory hole. It now sets out what might be described as Plan B. Plan B, as far as I can see, while reading through this article, is to try to persuade the Russians to agree to freeze the conflict in Ukraine so as to preserve Ukraine, leaving the Russians with a lot less in terms of their objectives in the conflict in Ukraine than the ones they have been articulating. But with the inducement that the United States will seek a rapprochement with Russia, a lifting effectively of sanctions, a re-establishment of diplomatic contacts, and all that kind of thing. But it is not an attempt to achieve a sincere reconciliation with Russia, not really based on any profound feelings of friendship or desire to achieve friendship with that country. Mr. Wes Mitchell no longer believes that Russia can be defeated in Ukraine. He no longer believes that regime change in Russia can be engineered. He doesn't talk about any of that in this article, this latest article, but then that is clearly the implications of the article. He acknowledges that for the moment it is going to be impossible to get the Russians to break with China entirely. But his thinking is that if the United States can repair its relations with Russia, can start talking and having a dialogue with the Russians again, then over time it might nonetheless still be able to achieve that objective. It can insert itself into the Russian-Chinese relationship. It can pour thoughts into the Russian ear about how the Chinese are overbearing and masterful, how Russia can't trust them, how they're out to dominate Russia, all of those things. Mr. Wes Mitchell, like most Americans, takes it as read that the Russians have a deep suspicion of China and that basically they're very unhappy at what Mr. Wes Mitchell imagines is a subordinate relationship to China. And, well, Mr. Wes Mitchell has persuaded himself that if the Americans keep at that, then over time the Americans can engineer rifts in the relationship between China and Russia. And though he doesn't exactly say this, at some point pries the two apart. And that, according to Mr. Wes Mitchell, is how to conduct great power diplomacy. And as was the case in his previous article, the one in the National Interest, it is an article that is full of erudition. It invokes Bismarck, just as his article in August 2021 invoked Bismarck. It has an extended passage quoting King Archidamus of Sparta at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the 420s BC. By the way, he's not actually quoting King Archidamus. We don't actually know what King Archidamus said, if he said anything at that particular time. He's quoting a speech written by the Athenian historian Thucydides, which Thucydides attributes to King Archidamus of Sparta. But anyway, let's put all that aside. As I say, it's full of erudition, It tells us that this is what great diplomacy is. It makes the acknowledgement that the United States is no longer the absolute hegemonic unipolar power that it was a short time ago. It accepts that the United States must maneuver and intrigue and do all of these sort of things. And it believes that if it does this with skill and cunning, then it can divide and conquer. And he actually uses those very words in order to bring the Russians onto its side, divide them from the Chinese, and that will be the way that the United States secures its foreign policy position in the future going forward, its hegemonic position. Now, he also adds a few details. He speaks about the fact that the United States has made mistakes in its efforts to freeze the conflict in Ukraine. He said that the United States is very wrong to seek a final settlement of the conflict with the Russians. That plays to the Russians' advantage. What the United States ought to have done instead was to limit itself to getting the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. And he takes it as read that the Russians actually do want a ceasefire because supposedly their army is exhausted, their military campaign in Ukraine has been underwhelming, and their economy is under immense strain. I think I have summarised Mr. West Mitchell's article correctly, though I do not have made no attempt to convey its tone, which, by the way, I find remarkable. Now, I'm going to make two immediate observations about this. It seems to me that what Mr. West Mitchell is outlining is essentially the approach that General Kellogg and Marco Rubio have been taking. They too have been trying to persuade the Russians to agree to a freeze of the conflict. All their efforts have been directed to that end, and they've not actually been interested. They have shown no interest in a long-term final solution of the conflict. If you listen to General Kellogg, he scarcely ever talks about that. And when he does, he makes it quite clear that he expects ultimately that the eventual outcome, maybe in 10, 20 years, will be that Ukraine gets back all it wants, that it gets back the 4 regions, maybe even Crimea, and even entry into NATO, and there should be demilitarized zones, and there should be NATO forces based into Ukraine, and all of those kind of things. So he basically, Kellogg, what he's been really focused on is getting the ceasefire. And I get the sense that this is what Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who incidentally Mr. West Mitchell lavishes praise on in this article. That is the objective that Marco Rubio has been pursuing as well. Freezing the conflict, achieving some kind of dialogue with the Russians, some kind of a rapprochement with the Russians. And going further and taking ideas from Mr. West Mitchell, one can see that one objective again is to make trouble ultimately between the Chinese and the Russians. Marco Rubio, Mr. Rubio, has been consistently hostile to China. He continues to speak of China's malign influences. He is one of those foreign policy hawks or neocons in the American political system who has been much more antagonistic to China than he has been to Russia. And I think that it's not difficult to see, again, that General Kellogg and Marco Rubio are following very much along the lines outlined by Mr. West Mitchell. A freeze of the conflict, an attempt to at least give the appearance of getting on with the Russians, but with a much more insidious objective, ultimately, of creating rifts between Russia and China in order to ultimately collapse the strategic partnership between the two. Now, again, just as happened in 2021, 2022, I find it impossible to believe that this article by West Mitchell can be as similar to the policies, the policies pursued by the Kellogg-Rubio-Waltz grouping of the Trump administration to be mere coincidence. Again, I don't know who has been talking to whom or what exact discussions have been taking place. I suspect that these discussions have been going on in Washington within the colossal and Byzantine foreign policy establishment for a very long time, probably since the autumn of 2023, when it became clear that Ukraine would not be able to inflict a military defeat on Russia. And that, again, what Mr. West Mitchell is doing is outlining the consensus approach being taken by, well, let's call them the neocons. Now, I'm going to say something here, and I'm going to say this very quickly. What Mr. West Mitchell is proposing is not realistic. It is not a return of great power diplomacy. Diplomacy is not conducted in this way. True diplomacy is not conducted in this way. It was not conducted in this way by Bismarck. Just to say, contrary to what Mr. West Mitchell might suppose. It's an approach that is both profoundly cynical and at the same time utopian. Profoundly cynical because it involves telling the Russians that we want good relations with you and want to be your friends. Whereas in reality, that is not the case at all. The approach is entirely manipulative. It's all about trying to create problems between Russia and its main ally and friend, which is, of course, China. So it is cynical and it is ultimately manipulative and duplicitous as well. But it is also utopian. When I first read that article in the National Interest by Mr. West Mitchell back in August 2021, the one in which he outlined his grand plan of inflicting a defeat on Russia in Ukraine, I thought this man had taken leave of his senses. I couldn't believe that he was seriously proposing something so completely unrealistic. The idea of inflicting a military defeat on a great power, which is also a nuclear superpower, in its own backyard, in a conflict which it would see as existential to itself, seemed to me fantastic. And, well, there was absolutely no possibility that it would happen. And I'm going to say exactly the same about this latest plan by Mr. West Mitchell. For all the display of erudition, which is real, Mr. West Mitchell obviously reads an awful lot. For all the conjurings up of Bismarck and King Archidamus of Sparta and all of that. What he's proposing is absolute fantasy. We've just seen this meeting that has taken place between Putin and Xi in Moscow. We see the extraordinary friendship that exists between the two men. We see the deep trust that the Russians and the Chinese at the highest levels have with each other. I have seen in both China and Russia the goodwill that the people of each of these countries now feel towards us. I've seen also the lists of officials who participate in the discussions between the Chinese and the Russians. I think the idea that the United States could seriously create differences between these two countries is a total fantasy. The only consequence, in fact, the completely predictable consequence of any attempt to try to do so is that it would further infuriate and antagonize both. It is almost inevitable that in that case, the Russians and the Chinese would compare notes with each other, as people, by the way, regularly do when they are the objects of these kind of intrigues. And it would make them mistrust and perhaps hate the Americans even more. And the idea that the Russians are in a disastrous situation, that their military has proved less effective than Mr. West, then they themselves imagined, that Ukraine is somehow holding its own successfully, that the Russian economy is on the brink of crisis, and that this is going to push the Russians to make concessions and to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine, to freeze the conflict in Ukraine. That is a complete fantasy also. I am not exactly sure how much influence Mr. West Mitchell has. I suspect a very great deal. But if this is what he thinks is great power strategy, then the best advice I can give is don't listen to him. Because following this advice is going to prove every bit as disastrous as following the advice that he gave back in August 2021 has turned out to be. I'm not denying, as I said, that he's a clever man in his way and that he has read an awful lot, but I just don't think he really understands great power diplomacy in any true sense. Now, I say that, I go back to what I was saying about J.D. Vance. I think that J.D. Vance gets it. I obviously get the sense that Kellogg, Rubio, and the others don't. Now, I say that, I'm well aware of the inevitable rejoinder. Mr. West Mitchell has served in the State Department. He is a veteran Foreign Service officer of the United States Diplomatic Service. I obviously am not. Maybe people will say, why listen to you and not to Mr. West Mitchell, who is, after all, just writing about his trade? Well, all I would say in response is that if you did listen to Mr. West Mitchell in August 2021 and you did follow his advice then, look where it has got you. Look where you are now, where the United States finds itself now. Losing in Ukraine, not defeating the Russians there, and with the Russian Chinese strategic partnership stronger and closer than ever. Anyway, perhaps I've devoted too much time to Mr. West Mitchell. I'm not going to return to this anytime soon. But anyway, I feel I have to speak out about it. I know this article has attracted a great deal of attention, and I think it's only proper if I then express my own opinions about this. Well, anyway, let's now turn to what's actually been happening. The military parade has taken place in Moscow. It's been massive and resplendent. There's been no sign of any attempt over the course of the day, thank goodness, for the Ukrainians trying to interfere in it in any material form. The parade, as I said, went through peacefully. That has not been true across the front lines. However, unfortunately, as I discussed, the Ukrainians continue their efforts to break through and to capture Totkino. They do seem to have at some point captured some houses in this small village. The Russians say they've been driven out. I suspect the Ukrainians claim otherwise. Again, I'm not there. I don't know. But it's clearly a breach of the ceasefire, however you want to construe it. There's been other fighting in other places. And maybe I should say now that though the Russians themselves claim that they have observed the ceasefire strictly, I'm not 100% sure that that is the case. There's been, for example, there's information of significant advances by the Russians in the village of Bogatyr in southwest Donetsk region. This is a fortified village which the Russians broke into some days ago. And they do seem to have made significant progress in that village. That progress might have been made before the ceasefire, but I'm not sure. It might have happened after. There's also now film of Russian troops in the village of Zverove, which is immediately on the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. Now, this is very close to that section of Pokrovsk where there were pictures of fighting involving Russian soldiers just a few days ago. Now, there's been much speculation about those pictures. I've seen some people claim that there was no real fighting in southern Pokrovsk, that the Russians never broke into southern Pokrovsk at all, that what we were seeing was a small group of Russian soldiers who lost their way and stumbled into the city until the Ukrainians basically defeated and destroyed them. That's what some people say. Others are saying that it was just a reconnaissance group conducting a raid in Pokrovsk and nothing more than that. The Russian newspaper Radovka, however, made comparisons between the way in which the Russians infiltrated Toretsk in May of last year with small groups that then consolidated and expanded their control and ultimately destabilized the defenses in southern Toretsk, and the fighting, what appeared to be the fighting in southern Pokrovsk. I will not pretend that I know exactly what is going on in southern Pokrovsk. There's been lots of film of heavy Russian shelling and bombing and missile attacks in the area of southern Pokrovsk. And we now have further proof that the Russians are probably in complete control of this small village of Zverove, which is essentially an outlying suburb of Pokrovsk. It could be that the Russians have in fact established a presence in southern Pokrovsk. The pictures of the Russian troops in Zverev may suggest it. Let me repeat again. I am not there. I don't know this for a fact. I might be wrong. There's also other evidence of the Russians having made further advances close to the town of Liman, in the other part of the front lines near the city of Slavyansk. Again, this could have happened before the ceasefire. Maybe it did. Probably it did. But we've only learnt about this after the ceasefire was prepared. Against that, we also have other reports that the Ukrainians have breached the ceasefire by launching counterattacks on the Russians in the Kherson area, in the area of the Antonovsky Bridge, which is to say in the city of Kherson itself, or close to the city of Kherson itself, and of the Ukrainians launching heavy artillery strikes on Russian military positions in the Kinburn Spit, an area, basically the tip, the southern tip of the East Russian-controlled bank of the Dnieper River. Again, to repeat, there were reports over the last couple of days that the Russians had established bridgeheads in Kherson region. Again, this might or might not be true, but certainly those reports have been circulating. So anyway, one way or the other, I think one is justified in saying that the truce held in Moscow. The parade was able to take place unhindered. It does not seem to have held in other places, and it absolutely did not hold in Kursk region, where I don't think there is any serious doubt that it was the Ukrainians who were the violators. So I don't myself believe that this negotiating process is going to go further, but it does look as if one way or the other, over the last couple of days, the Russians have indeed achieved significant further advances, which perhaps bring them closer to the moment when they could carry out their major advance and break into further areas of Ukraine and start storming the crucial towns and cities in Donbass. Well, I'm going to finish this video by returning to another subject which is very close to my heart, which is the disastrous policies, as far as I'm concerned, of the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Apologies again for those of you who are getting bored by my coming back to this, but Keir Starmer has recently, over the last couple of days, announced two great trade agreements which he sees as breakthroughs, paving the way for a future revival of the British economy. One is a trade agreement with India. Now, India is a rising country. Its economy is growing fast. It's a huge country. One day, perhaps, this trade agreement will have meaningful consequences for Britain. Given the state of trade between Britain and India at the moment, I don't see how presently this can be true. But there was one particular provision in this agreement which did cause my eyebrows to rise. This is a provision which says that Indian employees of Indian companies, I believe it is Indian companies, or maybe also British companies, Indian companies or British companies with businesses in India who assign Indian workers to work in Britain. Those workers, those Indian workers in Britain, will not have to pay national insurance, British national insurance, for 3 years. That's my understanding of the provision. Now, national insurance, for those who don't know, it sounds like an insurance policy which British citizens pay in order to access the British social services. And in its origins, that was true. But in practice, the British government uses the funds that it receives from national insurance contributions in any way that it pleases, and so it is essentially a tax. So what this provision says, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand it exactly, but the essence of what it says is that for a certain period anyway, workers from India who work in Britain will be exempt from one particular rather onerous and actually quite widely resented tax. Now, what is the sense of this? Everybody who follows politics in Britain knows that there is deep unhappiness about the state of immigration within British society. And here is Keir Starmer granting tax benefits to immigrants from India. Admittedly, these people might not be here for very long. They might be just a special category of workers. It still seems to me a very, very strange political signal to make at a time when the government is already deeply unpopular. And all done in order to achieve a trade deal, which, as I said, is not going to make a radical difference to Britain's economic circumstances in the short term. Well, there it is. That's one piece of Keir Starmer's policy making, which I admit I don't understand. And I doubt very much that many people do either. But he's also now agreed what he calls a trade deal with Donald Trump, with the United States. Now, this is not a free trade deal. It is not a trade deal that provides for free trade between Britain and the United States, something which was suggested after Brexit, that Britain and the United States might agree a free trade zone with each other. As I said, this is not what this is at all. The 10% tariffs on Britain imposed by the Trump administration will remain in place. Some tariffs have been relaxed, but the British will accept in return imports of certain American agricultural products, such as beef, which, for all kinds of reasons I'm not going to go into, have been opposed by many people in Britain up to now. Sam Ashworth-Hayes, one of the very good writers on economics, who writes for the Daily Telegraph, has said that all that Starmer has actually achieved is he's reduced the weight of the Trump tariffs on Britain from $12.5 billion a year to $9.5 billion a year, as compared to a situation before March, where, of course, there were no such tariffs, so that there was no cost arising from them at all. Again, maybe there is a benefit. I understand that Range Rover, Land Rover will be in a better, find it easier from this point onwards to sell its cars to the United States. The tariff on imported motor cars into the United States from Britain has been scaled down. But against that, people in Britain are going to have the option, if that is the right word, of buying beef from the United States, something which British farmers, who are already unhappy with the Starmer government for many reasons, probably will not appreciate, and which for all sorts of other reasons was an unpopular idea anyway. Again, I don't fully get this. I wonder whether the political price is worth the marginal economic gain. But that is Keir Starmer. That is the way he conducts government in Britain. To be honest, I think come the next election, I think it will be a miracle if Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister, if the Labour Party is left with any representation in Parliament at all. At any rate, if things continue with the way they are. Anyway, that's my programme for today. Apologies for its late publication. There were many things to do today, including trying to catch up with the events on Victory Day, and also for the singular appearance of my dog. But anyway, there we are. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.